So welcome everyone to Threads of Knowledge, Dindga McCannon and Aliyah Bonnette in conversation. Thank you for joining us this evening. Please note that closed captioning in English is available by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. I'm Mathilde Walker-Billot. I am Curator of Programming at the American Folk Art Museum. And I'm joining you today from Queens in New York. And before we begin, I want to acknowledge that our museum stands upon Lenape-Hawking, the unceded traditional homeland of the Lenape-Delaware peoples. We honor Lenape people, past, present, and future, and are committed to centering Indigenous perspectives in exhibitions and programs at the museum. As many of you know, AFAM is dedicated to uplifting the work of self-taught and folk artists across time and place. And we are thrilled to celebrate both historical and contemporary works of quilters and textile artists across the United States with one of our current exhibitions, What That Quilt Knows About Me, now on view at the museum until October 29th. Drawing from the museum's vast collections of textiles, this exhibition features a wide range of quilts and related works of art spanning the 19th through 21st centuries. In this exhibition, textiles are understood as objects that play a central role in our life, carrying stories and histories from one generation to the next. The curators, Emilie Gewalt and Shade Ayorinde, consider quilts as documents of cultural and political significance, holding poignant and sometimes invisible informations about their makers, their communities, their times and places. Organized in conjunction with the exhibition, the program tonight is the third and final segment of a series of conversations called Thread of Knowledge. In this series, we expand on the idea that quilts and textile works carry powerful meanings and can be approached as tactile archives, unconventional and eloquent traces of the past, singular and radical record for the present and the future. So we'll explore the special ways in which quilting, sewing, stitching, weaving, and knitting contribute to the production and transmission of knowledge across generations and geographies. So tonight we're really honored, thrilled, and grateful to have with us Dindga McCannon, the artist behind Mary Lou Williams, Jazz Pianist, a quilt-like piece currently on view in the exhibition, What That Quilt Knows About Me. And you can see it here on the slide. This vibrant combination of found objects, paint, photographs, and fibers is a tribute to great jazz musician Mary Lou Williams and the rich environment of Harlem where she lived and worked. Dindga McCannon's mixed media piece is also an artistic statement where the artist riffs on the quilting form to question its tradition and revalue its history and meaning. So this piece is part of a section of the exhibition titled Reinventing Tradition, where a series of mixed media works by the artists Ray Matterson, Kate Clayton Donaldson, or Jessie Donahue invites us to experience the boundless artistic possibilities of quilt making. So tonight, Dindga McCannon is joined by Aliyah Bonnette, a contemporary quilter and textile artist who also drew inspiration from the women in her family and community, and also moves across various techniques, materials, and processes to record experiences of African-American women. So using Mary Lou Williams, jazz pianist, as a departure point, this program will not only reconsider quilting practices in past and present times, but also elucidate these traditions within an African-American context and a feminist context. And tonight, we're also thrilled to have Desan Lopez-Cassel, a friend and a colleague who is with us tonight. So Desan Lopez-Cassel is a New York-based editor, writer, and curator. She gravitates towards moving image and visual art and is concerned with race, gender, decoloniality, and the politics of paradise. As editor-in-chief of Black Stars Journal, Scene, castle platforms, film, art, and visual culture writing by and about people of color, carving out more opportunities for nuanced, slow journalism. So she will be our host tonight. So before I hand it over to Desan, I have a quick note on the structure of the program. Desan will start with a short introduction, then we will hear from our two speakers. And after this presentation, everyone will be in conversation for about 30 minutes. There will be time for questions, so please share questions for speakers throughout the program using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And I will be using the chat room to share more details about the program and the speakers. Today's program is being recorded and will be made available online in the coming weeks. Many thanks to our IT director, Richard Ho, who is always behind the scene. Thank you, Richard, for your technical support today, and also to all of you for being here. We're grateful for opportunities like this to connect online, which will not be possible without you. I hope you will consider supporting our program through a donation to the museum following this conversation. Your support has great impact and makes a difference in our ability to champion the work of folk and self-taught artists. So hi, Desan, and please take it away.
Thank you, Mathilde, and thank you for the invitation. It's honestly such a pleasure to be here tonight with all of you watching and tuning in, and also to join Dindga for another conversation and to be in conversation with Aliyah. As someone who has learned so much about art making by being in conversation with other artists, it's always a pleasure to be able to be part of another conversation publicly. So I'm just going to share a little bit more context about each of our artists so that folks can have a broader understanding of the trajectory of their careers. And then I will turn it over to Dindga for her to start sharing a bit more about her work. So I'll start with Dindga to introduce her. Born in New York City and raised in Harlem and the Bronx, Dindga McCannon came of age as an artist and young mother during the rise of feminist art in New York City and the civil rights movement across the nation. Dindga began her career studying under Harlem Renaissance artists such as Jacob Lawrence, Charles Alston, Richard Mayhew, and Al Loving at the Art Students League of New York and the Robert Blackburn printmaking workshop. She went on to become a pillar of the influential African-American art collective Weusi, and later a co-founder of Where We At, a Black women artists, a noteworthy collective affiliated with the Black arts movement. McCannon's use of oil painting, printmaking, and sewing made her an early influencer of textile assemblage, found object quilting, and wearable art, all of which expand upon the legacy of African and African-American culture and historical memory. Her works often focus on the history and stories of women, which we will be talking about tonight, as well as iconic figures, unknown heroines, family, and friends who shape her vibrant universe. McCannon's work is in the public collections of the Brooklyn Museum, the Studio Museum in Harlem, and the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and Michigan State University, among others. She's been included in recent exhibitions, including We Wanted a Revolution, Black Radical Women, 1965 through 1985, organized by the Brooklyn Museum, and Black Power at the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, Tennessee. Aliyah Bonnette is originally from North Carolina and is an improvisational quilter who combines textile manipulation and oil painting to present scenes of Black womanhood and diasporic identity. Aliyah is a 2021 graduate of East Carolina University, where she earned her Bachelor's of Fine Arts. I'm looking forward to speaking with both of you, and I will turn it over to Dindga.
Hi, thank you for the invitation to be here. My name is Dindga McCannon, and I'm a mixed media, multimedia artist. In this conversation, we'll be talking about my fiber art process, but I'm a painter, muralist, bookmaker, and a mom. And I'm really thrilled that this piece of mine, Mary Lou Williams, is included in the exhibition. This was probably my most freest quilt in terms of this form. And I'm telling the story of Mary Lou Williams, who many people know as a jazz pianist, but she also played so many other forms of music, and I've written them out on the right-hand side of the quilt. On the left-hand side of the quilt is some of the other things that she was. Arranger, composer, and everybody knows that she was a pianist. And there's also quite a bit more about Mary Lou Williams that I need to tell. So there'll be a Mary Lou Williams jazz pianist quilt #2 at some point. This piece is Jazzmobile. I've done a lot of work with music simply because a lot of times, because I work all day long, the only time I would have to go out is late at night, and I go to the jazz clubs. And consequently, I began drawing, and the next thing you know, I was making the subject of jazz the subject of some of my work. This quilt is dedicated to Jazzmobile, a New York City institution which has provided free jazz in the summertime for probably 30, 40 years, and they're still in existence. And they have concerts of major musicians all over New York, and they're free. And I've attended many of them. I didn't draw this from anything that I saw, but it was the flavor and the fact that this was an organization that wanted to make sure that one of our art forms got out into the community. This is Women in Jazz #1. I have several pieces with this name. For years, I did, I guess, images of men musicians, and sometimes with women. But maybe like 15 years ago, I found out in the well, actually from 1890 through about 1930 and 40, there were hundreds of all-women bands. And I decided that I wanted to tell the story. This is probably my first piece in that series. The danglies, that's what I call the pieces of fabric that are down underneath the quilt. These are the names of different women in music and the instruments they played. Like, for example, I have Anna Mae Wilburn, who was a trumpet player and also one of the first band leaders. The work is made out of all kinds of stuff because to me, if it can be sewn onto a piece of fabric, it's fair game. So I have charms, paper, things that I've collected, laces, chiffon I'm very fond of, and lots of strings and charms in this piece. This is one I made several years later. Is Women in Jazz again. And this time I've got the whole band. I've made the images a lot bigger. And I have collections of music fabric, which you can see in here. I use the foots because when you're listening to jazz or any other music, you usually tapping your feet. And so to me, that represents like the audience. And I've used all kinds of beads and vintage stuff to just speak about the period and the clothing that these women wear. It's basically painted, machine quilted, machine applique. This is Charlie Parker. This piece started as an oil painting in the 80s. And the oil painting sat around for years and it didn't go anywhere. It wasn't talking to me. And so probably in 2009, I decided to cut the face up and discard the rest of the work. I ended up putting it in a quilt and it worked out a lot better. The danglies, once again, the structures on the bottom, these are a few, and I mean a very small amount of the musicians that he influenced, because Charlie Parker was a very powerful artist. His influence is still being felt today. And I have birds surrounding him because his nickname was Bird, because he sounded like a bird. He was so beautiful. And it's made out of all kinds of cottons and rayons and knits, silks, and a lot of stitching, machine pieced and machine stitched and embroidered. This is Bessie Smith, who is one of my personal sheroes. Um, I left the face blank because I think anybody can be a shero. It's just a matter of what you do in this life and how you affect people. I draped this piece of fabric. I don't remember the original reason, but the era that Bessie came out of, the thing that really sings to me is the opulence and the clothes that they wore. They were beaded and they were gaudy and they were gold and they were silver. And this was part of their persona as entertainers, but as an artist, all the different textures and color, it makes me want to tell their story even more so. This was done 2020. I'm still doing my Women in Jazz series. I changed the format because I was searching for a freer form of taking a quilt. Instead of it being a rectangle, here I'm playing with different types of shapes. So I've got this form that surrounds the painted image. Once again, I have a huge collection of music fabrics. Anytime I go anywhere and I see a fabric with anything relating to music, I buy it. And sooner or later, I have a use for it. And this work is mostly hand painted and then quilted. This is my favorite piece. It's called Blues Queens #1. Once again, I doing my research, I found out that there was all of these blues women of color from the 19 from actually from 1894 to about 1930. And these were women I had never heard of, most of them. I mean, Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith, everybody knows them, but these were women that were basically unknown. And so I decided to include them and to tell their story. I have my images of them within the body of the sculpture. I have feathers on top, and you can't see over the feathers, but the whole uh, diameter is hand beaded. The pieces coming, once again, the danglies have sort of taken another shape on the bottom. Embroidered in here is some of the songs that these women wrote, because not only were they vocalists, but they were amazing songwriters, but people don't know that. So I've chosen to tell that part of their story. This is what I'm working on currently, or one of the things I'm working on. This is Blues Queens #2, and this is basically how Blues Queens #1 was started. I work in panels, and then I sew the panels together, and then the panel is fitted over the armature, which is a wooden tower. These two women, this one is a little, I'm using chronologically a little later, from like 1920 to 1950. This is on your right is Big Mama Thornton. On the left is Mildred Bailey, who she passed herself off as a white woman. She was very successful, but she was half Native American, and very few people knew that. But I think that discussion is being open these days. And I thought she was a very interesting character. And so this is what I'm working on currently. It'll take me about 5 or 6 months to finish the piece, but I did get started. So. And this.
Hi, you guys. My name is Aliyah Bonnette, like you guys know. I think that as an artist, me personally, I believe that knowing a little bit about the history of the artist really informs the work and people's practices. And so I really wanted to start off by sharing a photo of my grandfather. This is my grandfather, Steve. I'm Sam Harvey, and he really got me into quilting because what you see here is him giving me all of my grandmother's fabrics and quilts that she never finished before she passed away. My grandmother passed away before I was born, and when I started quilting, that's when I learned that she started quilting. So I had no idea about this until I started to practice up myself. Upon talking to my grandfather, he gifted me all of her fabric and quilts that he kept for over 25 years. And that really started my journey. Let's slide. This is the first quilt that I ever completed. I did this my sophomore year in college. I was presented with a prompt to make a painting that could be physically carried across a room without it just being a canvas, of course. And this is what came out of me. At that point, I was super into making work that was unapologetically Black, mainly because I was in classes and an environment where I was the only Black person in my classes. That led me to feel like I needed to educate, which I don't anymore. But this was the piece about the 5 most common Black stereotypes juxtaposed with some historical African-American quilting patterns. As I was learning more and more about this process, I wanted to, as a painter, figure out how I could paint on quilts. That was really what was foremost in my mind. So out of that came my senior show, which is this piece which is about a Black woman coming to terms with her sexuality in the face of colonization. And as she was going through that process, she was gaining this insight from her ancestors. I like to create narratives within my work that people can identify with, and also pull from my own experiences as a Black woman living in the United States. This is another piece from my senior show called When the Hate's Go Marching In. And this piece is about your ancestors. I really like to use symbology in my work that may not be super apparent to everybody. It really keeps it a little bit more personal for me and myself, which is a big difference from when in my very first quilt, which was extremely educational, and also all the imagery in there you really couldn't get away from. So my grandma was in Decatur, Georgia when she was quilting, which is why I used the peach motif as a way for the women in my quilts to gain knowledge from their ancestors. They were to eat the peach, and as they consumed the peach entirely, they started to become more themselves. This piece was a commission for East Carolina University, my alma mater. This piece is about Polly Murray. So bringing it back to Dindga's work a little bit, where, you know, really paying homage to the women that came before us and the people who came before us in history who paved the way for us. If you guys don't know about Polly Murray, I really encourage you guys to look them up. They were an amazing civil rights activist who helped write the argument that won the Brown versus Board of Education, and it wasn't even really she really wasn't honored for that. Actually, not a lot of people know that. They were also struggling with their identity as a queer person at that time, which ties back to, I think, both of our works, which is really talking about identity. Polly Murray is the person's name who this quote is for. This piece is one of my newer pieces. It's at the Contemporary Art Museum in Raleigh. This piece really helped me try to figure out how to break these boundaries of keeping quilts in a traditional rectangle format. And, you know, really me finding the power to do that, or the willingness to do that, was looking at artists like Dindga and people who came before me, and their willingness to break boundaries and set examples, and knowing that, you know, though you're working with one material that is steeped in history and tradition, you can experiment, you can break boundaries, and you can, you know, add things like paper, like beads, foil, paint to a quilt, and it still be a quilt, and it still be an important thing that we're pushing across. This piece is called She Realized You Weren't the Sun. This piece is more of an experimental piece for me. I think that I like to push myself past what I did before, and how can I add new materials how can I add, painterly aspects in ways that aren't just oil paint. And like Dinga said, if you can sew it, I'm going to do it onto a quilt. And so that's really what I tried to do. And so this is just, working with experimentation and learning that as especially as a young artist, you don't have to put yourself in a box, and you're really allowed to experiment and still work through concepts that you're thinking about and you're learning about while also creating work.
Thank you, Aliyah, and thank you, Dinga, for sharing about your work. There's plenty there for us to discuss, and I really want to start with this image because I want to go back to something that each of you mentioned about your practices. You both work in a variety of media, which includes quilting, but that's not the only way in which you make art. And this particular work, Dinga, that's in the show and that's here on screen in front of us, I think is really remarkable for the way in which it acts as a form of portraiture. It is abstracted, of course, and also is really pointing towards legacy and lineage and a lot of other things that I want to talk about. But maybe to begin, I'd love to hear from each of you about your practices and sort of what is it that spurs you to pursue a particular type of portrait in quilt as opposed to other media? Dinga, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, I think what inspires me to actually do a person, a woman in my instance mostly, is the fact that the person has led a very interesting life. A lot of times, sometimes nobody knows what they've been doing, or sometimes people know them for one thing, but the rest of the great things that they've done doesn't get as much attention. And so I like to tell those type of stories. The medium, the thing about, I call myself an art quilter. The thing that I really love about this particular medium is that you can use anything that you can get your hands on to tell a story. I have a vintage, coming down the middle of that is a piece of vintage trim that Corrine Simpson, who's an amazing photographer, called me up one morning and told me to come on downtown. Somebody's going out of business. And there was a man who had been in business for like 60 years selling vintage trims and whatnot. And that piece and a couple of the other pieces are two of the materials that I use to tell Mary Lou's story. That jazz thing I found on 23rd Street, it was the artist just laying in the window. And when I walked past the window, I saw it. I said, I have to have that. And I went in there and bought every square inch of it. That was probably 10, 15 years ago. And I've been piecing it out over the years as, the piece that I work on. If that works in there, then it's going in there. And art quilting is an amazing vehicle for visual artists because you have access to so much stuff, so many mediums. You can combine any particular art form that you're dealing with into a quilt.
Aliyah?
Yeah, I, like I said, was a painter first before I was a quilter, and I was naturally super into portraiture. And so I think that came pretty naturally for me as to figure out how to quilt. I think the real issue that I struggled a lot with was how to incorporate both together. So it didn't just seem like it was a painting on a quilt, but rather they were both so incorporated that you are going back and forth between looking at the quilt and looking at the figure and the other elements into my work. And also, I make narratives, and my stories sometimes are a little extensive, and I'm pulling from experiences that I've experienced and that the women who are extremely important to me in my life have told me about and experienced. And I think for me, the best way to show that is the expressions that are within fingers.
I want to keep talking about the impact of other women on both of your practice. If we could go to the next slide. I was so glad to see you talk a bit about Polly Murray in this, because I think that they're a really great example of the impact of someone being felt, but not necessarily being credited. And I want to just sort of give like a quick plug and say that if anyone's interested in learning more about Polly Murray, there's actually a great documentary about them called My Name is Polly Murray, which I think you can stream, so it's worth checking out. But I think this image really gives us a great sort of vehicle to talk about the fact that I think a lot of folks wouldn't normally associate quilting with like a documentary form or function. But I think that the way that you two both use quilting very much has that characteristic, where you are using quilt as a way of sort of keeping records of people who have come before you, nodding to their influences and really sort of paying tribute in a lot of different ways. Dindga, as you were just discussing, with like the sort of the danglies that you have in your work, which literally can trace someone's influence. And Aliyah as well, with talking about like these figures who have been overlooked, or also creating space for like everyday Black women in your work. And I would love to hear each of you talk a little bit more about the impact of other Black women on your practice, not just in terms of like the subjects that you're depicting, but also in terms of your process. Aliyah, could you start us off?
Yeah, I think that, women have been extremely important in my life. They've raised me, they keep me company when I'm not feeling okay, and I learn from them. And so it's important for me to, one, not just paint women or people who were identifying as women at the time, as Polly Murray was. It's important for me to pay homage to them. And if we really get down to the root of it, I'm a Black woman, and representation is extremely important in the art world and elsewhere. So if I can get a viewer to come in and view my work and they see a Black woman on my work, I'm doing something. And also to that extent, with Polly Murray, I think that, it's really just important to speak about people who aren't often spoke about, and to recognize them, identify their struggles, and also, portray them in the way that they want to be portrayed. I think is also extremely important.
Okay. And for me, I think when I came of age was in the 60s, we didn't have a lot of sheroes. There were a lot of Black women in the world doing things, but I didn't know about them. And I also had issues with the way that the artists that I was hanging out with, how they portrayed women. It was sort of condescending. And I know as myself and from the women that surrounded me, like my mom, my grandmother, aunt, we have a lot of powerful women, but they don't often go recognized. And the other reason why I use women a lot is because these are the women, like as an artist, particularly from the time of the 60s and 70s, being an artist was not a really sought after occupation. And because sometimes things get really, really hard. But I found that when I looked at the histories of other women who have come before me and saw some of the amazing things, like, for example, Althea Gibson, um, that they accomplished starting with basically nothing, that kind of gives me the energy to keep going, to keep trying, that I can do this because I have some role model to look at. They did this, so how come I can't be a successful artist? And it's very empowering. And I love telling stories, and telling stories about the unsung heroes and sheroes of the world empowers me.
Thank you both. I want to go to the next slide. This is a quilt that is on view in the exhibition and is in the Folk Art Museum's collection. And I think, according to Mathilde, this is one of the few quilts of this period where the enslaved person who actually did the labor of quilting it was actually acknowledged in like the credits sort of on like the back of the quilt. And I think that brings up a larger discussion of who gets to be credited with their work and also who just gets to be thought of as an artist. And I think that there's a broader conversation that comes about how that tends to play out when it comes to specifically textile work or self-taught artists, and the category of folk in particular being something that is being challenged, and rightly so in today's day and age. And I guess the question that I want to ask on this note is, like, as we think about who gets credited and who doesn't, I'd love to hear each of you talk about your research processes, like going back to what I was saying about the sort of almost like documentary and like record keeping element of your work. I'm curious to hear what your research process looks like as artists who are working not so much with words or sometimes, but who are thinking through histories living in textile and image, but otherwise still like creating a commemorative object. Either of you can take that one, whoever wants to start.
If you guys see this wall behind me, this is kind of how my research process begins, with writing. And so a lot of that starts with me writing prose, which helps kind of straighten out all the jungle that's going on in my mind. And then from there, I research and I look up scholarly documents. I figure out what sort of imagery that I want to put in the piece. And then I really want to be able to talk about it in a way that makes sense and that is factually correct, of course, as well. And especially when you're talking about Black history, that's a heavy topic sometimes to talk about. And with my line of talking about Black history, anyways, where I'm talking about, the Atlantic and the Middle Passage, and speaking about ancestry and where our ancestors are and where they come from, which from Black people are in Africa and from enslaved people. And so I need to honor that by doing the research first. That's extremely important to me. And so sometimes, like my pieces for my senior show, I did that research for a year, learning about haints, learning about ancestry, learning about where our ancestors may fall, and especially about traditional quilting. Because I'm quilting and because I am heavily changing it in terms of painting on it, beading on it, and other things like that, I still want to make sure that I am knowledgeable about the history of African American quilts, where they come from, what imagery is being used on the quilts, and how to respect quilts, because normally they're seen as craft. And if I'm bringing it into a fine art world, I need to know the history to speak about it in the way that it should be.
Okay. My research process is fairly simple. I do a lot of reading. And if I find a person who looks interesting, I order books. I go to Amazon, I go to eBay, I look at YouTube. Occasionally I'm blessed enough, like for example, the Charlie Parker work, I had a friend who actually knew him. So I would go to his house and sit down and he would tell me all of these very wild, amazing stories about Charlie. And that's basically my process, a whole lot of reading, uh, going to the ends of the world to find any kind of written material on the person. And like I said, if I'm lucky, find somebody who actually knew them, so I get a firsthand account of the personality that I'm dealing with. If not, I have to make it up.
Thank you both. And I think part of the reason that I asked that is I want to sort of tell the truth to the lie that is often repeated, that work involving textile, or that can sometimes be derided as craft, doesn't involve research or preparation, which I think is a very common misconception. And I think both of your practices really speak to the enormous amount of not only knowledge, but also preparation and specifically dedicated research that goes into each piece that you create, that create these records. which tell us so much about Black women's histories and Black history more broadly. I want to switch over to the next slide. And really just at this moment, I want to sort of acknowledge the intergenerational nature of the conversation that we're having. And Dindga in particular, I know we've had other conversations about many of the changes that you've seen in like the broader art world and about sort of what it has felt like to sort of witness and also be part of this kind of like resurgent interest in the work of Black artists. Like we've talked about that in the context of other museums and more this sort of like art world that's like very market driven and the kind of consequences that has had. I would love to hear you talk a little bit about sort of the changes that you've seen in conversations specifically about quilting and textile art as your career has progressed.
Well, I've found, I don't know, I guess artists are visionaries, and I've always done whatever it was that I felt that I wanted to do. But textiles in general, in my opinion, has always been the bastard child of the art world. It wasn't appreciated. We couldn't go into galleries because it was women's work, even though women make up half of the world. Um, and maybe in the last 10, 15 years, finally, the art world is opening its doors and welcoming textiles after all of this time. Um, I'm glad I'm still alive to see this happen because the women who created the quilts in the 1800s and 1900s, these were artists, but they were not allowed to call themselves artists because artist was a certain, it had a certain flavor and it simply didn't include us. And as you said, as textile artists, our work is way more labor intensive than any other art form that I could think of. I do a lot of different art forms, so I'm very familiar with how the process time. And it's also a great time because people have taken quilting out of the box. You can do traditional quilt, and there's room for everybody. You can do traditional quilt making, and it's beautiful, and it can be sold as an art piece. But then you could also go outside the box and do things that are mixtures or things that are experimental. So this is really a wonderful time for a textile artist or a fiber artist to be breathing. I could never understand the discrimination. I used to go to the George Brown quilting uh, conference every year in October, and I could never understand. It was a huge convention center with thousands of quilts, thousands of people selling stuff to make quilts, and yet the art world simply wasn't letting us in. So finally, I'm glad I'm here to see it. When I go to art shows now, I usually only photograph textiles because I'm so happy that the textiles are here. And I'm just amazed at the variety and what people are doing. It's incredible.
I agree. And I think it really speaks to what we were discussing earlier, which is that, it always seems to matter who's using these materials, like whether you get to be an artist, I think tends to depend not on like what you're working with, but how your identity is perceived. I think often like there's a parallel between textile work and also ceramic work in terms of how it has often been regarded as like, this is craft, or like this isn't work that requires an attribution, because there's not necessarily a consideration of the person who made it as an artist. And yet if we think about like, a lot of white conceptual artists or other artists who were working in the 60s who were working in ceramics but were automatically considered artists. So I think it really shows you the contradictions that exist in the art world, particularly where it comes to like the market and museum collections. It's often such a funny experience when you go to, say, an encyclopedic museum and you see where different works live in their collection displays. when ceramic work is displayed in an anthropological way and when it is displayed as artwork. So I think all of those are things that we're kind of all thinking about in a myriad or in a variety of ways. I want to shift over to our next image. I think this is the work that we were talking about the other day. I think we were having a conversation about similarly, like all the things that have changed in the realm of contemporary quilt making and textile work. This is, of course, a work by Janelle Levinson. It's called Vieques, and it is really sort of acknowledging the very deep influence of US colonialism in Puerto Rico, and specifically the ways in which Vieques has really been kind of used as a sort of atomic testing site, a sort of war area where a lot of the people of Vieques have not been able to enjoy sovereignty as well as basic freedoms. And I think what's interesting about this work is that the artist is using aluminum wrapped condoms with thread, a very untraditional material, to sort of gesture to the Puerto Rican flag. And I guess what I want to ask related to this work is, what else are you all seeing change in terms of like the materials of contemporary quilting? Like, what directions have you been excited to see the field going in? Aliyah, I would love to start with you since you are coming out of art school right now. What are some of the conversations you're having with your contemporaries about the direction of contemporary quilt making?
I think a lot of times people think that this is new, like textile work is new. And they go into a show, and oftentimes I might be one of the only textile artists or the only textile artist in that space. And a lot of times it's about learning how to incorporate that work into other shows, learning how to hang the work, learning how to talk about the work, but also, you know, I think really just learning how to move past that idea of what people think quilts are, which are, you know, for the bed. One of the first questions that I get when people come into my studio, which is open to the public, is my quilt for a wall? Like, they're confused. And so I think that a lot of it is still educating people on textile work and how labor intensive it is, because a lot of times they're not realizing that I'm making the quilt and I'm putting it together. I think it's just really just getting people to learn to understand the process.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Dindga, do you have anything to add to that in terms of directions of contemporary quilting?
Yeah, I think first of all, quilting is an art form in my mind, and probably a lot of other people, but in some people it's not. And as an art form, you have permission to go anywhere you choose to go. Yes, our grandmothers and great grandmothers and grandmas and some of our moms use fabric and thread. But in today's world, we have all of these materials. And just like outside of the quilting world, you have the conceptual art and this and that. This is what's being done, using all kinds of materials to tell the story. This is a powerful, powerful statement here. When I saw this quilt in person, I was blown away. I said, "You actually did what?" And it's beautiful and it works. And it works with the story that she's trying to tell. And it's refreshing. I think in today's world, people who quilt are also allowing themselves to be called artists, or acknowledging the fact that they are artists. Artists explore, artists push boundaries, artists open new doors, artists look, they research, they can always challenging, what a piece of art can be. And that's the moment that we're at this particular time. And it's great.
Yeah, I'd also like to chime in too that I think quilts are, people look at them and they feel comforted normally, right? And so I think it's interesting to push a boundary to where you're forcing somebody to be a little bit uncomfortable in the space that they would normally feel a bit more comfortable in. I think when you're thinking about that, it you're giving somebody to walk away and think, and to maybe want to learn more about the material and textiles as well.
I couldn't agree more. Richard, I actually want to go back to a slide of Aliyah's. It is the one that's wading in the waters of Oshun. So I want to ask a question related to this while looking at that work.
There you go.
Yeah. Aliyah, I think part of what you're both gesturing at is sort of like a reclaiming in a way that I think is really important. And I think this work, to me, like, it has this like very direct gaze, and of course like Oshun being the goddess of the waters, and sort of, you know, the way that water reclaims everything in the end. This really made me think a lot about the specific way in which you refer to yourself as an artist. Like, you identify as a mixed media quilter in particular, rather than as a textile artist or anything else that sort of nods to your material. Could you talk briefly about like why using the word quilter and how you refer to yourself is important?
Like I said before, the women in my life are extremely important to me. And the fact that this is a way that I can connect to my grandmother who passed away before I was born it speaks heavily to me, because in my head, I learned quilting through looking at her quilts. And I learned about her because I saw the fabric that she was pulling from and the stitches that she was creating. And so I really call myself a quilter, one, to connect to my grandmother, but to also connect to quilters everywhere, especially, you know, interestingly enough, a lot of quilters I come across don't call themselves artists. And in my head, there is absolutely no way that you can make a quilt without being an artist, whether you know the vocabulary or not to speak about it. And so sometimes I want to bridge that gap a little bit, and that you can be a quilter and still be in the fine art world. You don't necessarily, because you are in the fine art world, you know. The G's Bin quilters did not call themselves artists until they were told that they were artists, you know, and that's really where I'm coming from with that.
Thank you. I want to sort of bring us back to this beautiful detail shot of Dindga's work. Sorry, Richard, to make you move that through again. Thank you. I just want to make sure folks get an opportunity to look closely at like the very intricate details in this work. And I also want to remind folks that we will have time for questions from the audience. I really just want to ask one last question to our two artists before I turn it over to any folks who may have questions in the chat, or otherwise want to sort of bring up other things to discuss with these folks. And I guess I'll just ask, what do you two have coming up? Are there things that folks can look forward to in terms of other opportunities to find your work, to learn more about it, possibly experience it in person?
Well, I'm in a show at the Brooklyn Museum called Pavlomatic, and it's an interesting show. It'll be up through next year. However, I have a wood construction piece there and 2 prints. I'm also about to do with my son, who's also an artist. We're going to do a mural for the Rikers Island Welcome Center. And I think the other thing is to work on the Blues Queens #2 and see what form that's going to take. It'll either be a sculpture, but then I'm also playing with it being a wall piece. So, and also one more thing, I'm teaching a class through the Folk Art Museum and at Harlem Arts, which is up in Harlem. So that's August. That's it.
That's plenty. Aliyah, anything coming up?
Yeah, I have my first solo show, an 11-piece show in France in September. So I'll be working towards that. I'm working towards that. And I'll also have 2 pieces at Sika Gallery, which is the North Carolina Museum of Art offshoot gallery in Winston-Salem, in a really amazing group show in November. So I'll be working towards those things.
Wonderful. Thank you. And how can folks keep tabs on your work? Websites, Instagram, anything like that?
Instagram for me.
It's the same. My Instagram, and I can drop my Instagram handle in the chat so people can look at that.
Thank you both.
Thank you so much to all of you, to Dindga and Aliyah for being so generous tonight. It was really fascinating to learn more about your practices, and I think this discussion really challenged preconceived ideas of what a quilt is and should be, and I think that was a very generative and constructive approach to quilting tradition. We have a few questions from our audience. And so Aaron is asking, do either of the artists have a specific quilter influence? So if you both can talk about maybe an influence person or a quilter or an artist that informed your practice, that would be great.
Not a quilter. I think my practice has basically been influenced by fine artists. Because as a fiber artist, I basically was exploring new ground. So there was nobody that I could look to see, to be inspired by. So I had to do that myself. The artists that I've been influenced by is, of course, Faith Ringo, Charles Austin, Jacob Lawrence, an artist called Katie Kowitz, who no one knows, or there's not enough people that know about her. She did a lot of fine art drawings on the horrors of war. Singers like Bessie Smith, Ma Rainey, and Nina Simone. Those are my heroes and people I look for inspiration.
Me personally, I'm notorious for scrolling on Instagram and finding new artists that I can get insight from and learn from. I'm influenced by, Lisa Butler. I was influenced by Kara Walker for an extremely long time. Faith Ringo is a staple in my mind always. But I also read a lot, and because my works are narrative, I pull a lot from music as well, and authors like Marlon James. Octavia Butler's my favorite author ever, and of course, and artists, authors of that time as well.
And also we have someone who's asking if there are any specific textiles that you are excited to work with.
I would say two, the textiles that I dye myself, starting with white fabric, and also anything out of Africa, particularly the mud cloth, the Dinkra symbol cloth. And
I would say the exact same. Yeah, wax print fabric. Also, I dye a lot of my own fabrics as well. And then I pull from my grandmother's fabric and fabric that other people gift to me.
And I think also we have someone who's a big fan of Mary Lou Williams, and they said, one thing I love about you, Mary Lou Williams, talking to you, Dindga. This piece feels very experimental, and so this person is asking if you were inspired by the fact that Williams identified herself as an experimenter.
No, I was inspired by her life and the fact that there were so many more layers to her than she was recognized for. And like I said, I even have to do a second piece because between that piece and today, I found out other things about her that I find fascinating and amazing. And I'd like to tell that part of the story. And also, I think jazz too is like improvisational. Mm-hmm. And that's very much what we do. We are all on the same lines, just different medium. Aliyah spoke of herself as being an improvisational type of artist, and jazz art is sort of like the same thing, just different menus.
Yes, I think that's what is really interesting in your work. If you want to talk a little bit more about the influence of music and listening, is that it's not only the subject of your piece, but it's really part of your process. So maybe if you want to talk a little bit more about that, how listening, how improvisation techniques really are part of your practice, of your sewing practice. And maybe also, Aliyah, you if you want to talk a little bit more about this aspect of your work, the role of improvisation and the role also of intuition.
Okay. I think the lyrics of different musicians' music usually don't influence me. It's more like the life that they lived, the things that they did. However, when it comes to the blues queens, when I started listening to the music of the time, I was floored. I said, they said, what? What did they say? These were some bold, bodacious, outrageous human beings, and I love them. So, but other than that, it's really the what the person accomplished in their life, what they sort of meant to the rest of the artistic community, and stories that weren't told.
That for improvisation, it's really a simple answer. I am terrible at math, and anything that I have a short attention span, so it's hard for me to cut the same length of fabric 100 times and to work through a pattern. That's something that's personally difficult for me. And so if I can snip and rip fabric and make it fit into the squares, which is typically how I do it, if I'm being honest, that is a process that works a little bit better for me.
Do you have any, I don't see any more other questions, so we probably end here, except if you have anything you'd like to add, if Desan wants to ask another question. I just want to make sure you feel like you said everything you wanted to say tonight.
I do. I just want to echo all the beautiful praise that has been coming in for the two of you in the chat. And just say thank you for the conversation, and to you, Mathilde, for the invitation. It was such a pleasure.